So we're continuing with visual displays, and it shouldn't be too surprising that we spend a lot of time on visual displays and things like human factors. But it might be surprising to think about warning lights as a visual display, because they really are. So let's talk a little bit about how we provide good guidance on warning lights. It's appropriate for a particular warning to use only one warning light if possible. If several lights are required, sometimes that ends up confusing the person about which one they should pay attention to first. So this has been the case in things like 3 Mile Island, which was a nuclear power plant disaster, in which not only did one warning light go off, but lots and lots of warning lights went off. And it was really very difficult for the operator to figure out, or operators in this case, to figure out which warning lights to pay attention to, because everything was going off at once, and it was really confusing. So the ability to provide it in just one light really makes sense. If it turns out that several lights are required, if they're absolutely necessary for some reason, consider using a master light and a word that indicates that specific condition. Here's an example of that. This is a laser on in a radiation device. It should also be the case that the light should be at least twice as bright as the immediate background. Different meanings will depend on whether something is in a steady state condition, like a steady state light is continuous, so constantly on, for example. A flashing light, on the other hand, should be used for something like occasional emergencies or new conditions. And flash rate should be about, say, 4 times per second. Warning lights, of course, should be usually red and should be sizable enough for people to see. It's not absolutely critical, the color of light, as long as there's good enough contrast, but not surprisingly, red tends to be particularly good in terms of conveying meaning. That is, red is really useful for signifying danger, for example. When you lay out a set of multiple displays, you're going to need some kind of organizing scheme. And this is the scheme that people typically use. You display things according to, first, their frequency of use, so that frequently used displays should be in the what we call the primary visual area right in front of people where they can see it easily. And then, second, by importance of use. Sometimes we'll switch these so the important thing is more focused, but often the important thing isn't the most frequently used, so you'll have to do some trade-off there. And then display things according to their relatedness or their sequence of use. So that's that proximity compatibility notion. Place related displays close together. And then make sure you're consistent about this, so that once somebody's learned it once, they don't have to learn it time and time again for different kinds of displays. So that's an example. Here's some other examples. Stimulus response compatibility, that's related to proximity compatibility. The display should be close to their associated controls and should sort of move in the same direction as their controls. So if I'm turning something up on a dial, then the dial ought to move to the right, for example, if I'm turning clockwise. And then provide a reasonable visual angle, meaning space between all pairs of displays when possible. Here's just 2 examples from your book. They're not the greatest examples, unfortunately, but this gives you an idea. These are just clustering things together in a reasonable semblance, whereas these things are, kind of obviously all over the place. Head-up displays are becoming more popular. The idea behind a head-up display is you superimpose information on top of the primary visual display. The primary visual display in an automobile, of course, is the windshield. So here you can see we've got all kinds of information about the driving task happening right here on the windshield. There's some advantages, of course there's some disadvantages with this as well. The advantages are that the scene far away and the scene in the instrumentation can be sort of monitored without moving your head or necessarily refocusing. You can overlay the information with the scenery in the world to sort of, make it look like it's all one thing, what they call conformal. This helps in things like landing a plane, etc. So here's an example from a plane display. You can see how that works out pretty well, lining yourself up with the runway and so forth, all right here. It yields reduced time to look at the speedometer and so forth. So it has some disadvantages though. One is that it tends to produce clutter. And this is actually seen to have been a factor in what's called a runway incursion, where one plane came very close to hitting another plane when they were doing simulation research. The other problem with this is that it's not only our eyes that focus, but it tends to be our attention that focuses as well. So while we're focusing here, for example, even our attention, not our eyes necessarily, but while we're attending to this here, it's quite unlikely that we're going to be attending to that up there. So in many ways, it's still not just one display. It's still lots and lots of displays. And you run into the same problems that you would have if this thing were off to the side a little bit. So it's not perfect by any means, and we're still trying to work out how to make this thing better and better, or whether it makes sense to have these head-up displays at all. It's a real active area of research. Related to that are head-mounted displays. These are obviously mounted to your head or helmet, so it can be viewed no matter where you move your head. There's all kinds of these things out there these days, of course, and they're getting cheaper and cheaper, but they enable the user to track information while scanning the environment, for example, and keeps their hands free for other activities. One way of looking at displays is trying to combine multiple variables in that display. So here's an example from medicine. And in this particular case, it's looking at various micronutrients in the body. And these micronutrients are things like sodium and potassium and so forth, glucose and so on. The idea here is that if everything was going well, it would all be within sort of one nice sort of octagonal range here. But in this particular case, it looks like their creatinine and their glucose are probably a little bit off. Well, it's certainly their creatinine is off. And you can just look at this, and by looking at the pattern, give an idea of what's going on here. It's also the case that their BUN is off. So let me think about this. I can't probably tell you what that means. It probably has something to do with kidney problems, though. Okay. Here's another type of display that makes great sense to design, and it's really based on Gestalt principles of sort of the sum being worth or telling you more information than the whole telling you more information than the sum of its parts. So for example, I can look at this display, and if everything was great, I would be able to look right across here and see that everything was more or less on the same level. But here, I can tell, because this is the one dissimilar thing, that everything is not great, and there's a problem with the feed water pressure. And I can tell that right here pretty easily. So it's called spot checking or check reading, and you can just look at this and see that at a glance. The same thing is true here. If I have a whole bunch of gauges, for example, you can see automatically that, oh, this one's askance, this one's different than these other ones, and I could go in and look at that. And then finally, I think I've talked plenty about navigation displays and so forth, but they're an exciting area for human factors these days. And you will see all kinds of improvements, hopefully, and changes for sure, coming in the design of navigation displays in automotive and in aviation.